Welcome to Authors and Innovators. This is a conversation with Dan Ward, and given our theme of change makers, the future is now, Dan Ward and his latest book, Lift, really fit our themes of imagining change, testing, building, and taking off. So I'm delighted to have Dan Ward here with us. Dan is a writer and a senior principal systems engineer at MITRE Corp. Dan's also an Air Force veteran. He received the Bronze Star for his service in Afghanistan, leading a team of officers from 5 different countries. So he knows a lot about innovation and collaboration. His work has appeared in a variety of outlets, including Fast Company, Forbes, Harper's, the Boston Globe, the Armed Forces Journal, Small War Times Journal, Time Magazine's Battleland blog, and among others. So I'm thrilled to talk about his new book, Lift, Innovation Lessons from Flying Machines That Almost Worked and the People Who Nearly Flew Them. So Dan, this is such a fun book. It really is a playful introduction to flying machines from the late 1800s and the inspiring innovators who designed, built, launched, and crashed them. It's also a serious guide to innovation, but in a lot of ways, it struck me after reading it that it's a bit of a study in failure. So tell me why you wrote this book.
Yeah, Larry, thanks so much for having me be part of this session. I'm delighted to have a chance to chat about this. Lift is my third book, and it's a book I'd been wanting to write for kind of a long time. Probably 10 years ago, I came across an old book titled Progress in Flying Machines, published in 1894, so about 9 years before the Wrights had their first successful flight. And the book was just full of these fascinating stories of flying machines from the late 1800s. And some of them are absolutely bonkers, like flapping wings with feathers glued all over them. And I fell in love with these stories. And the more I read about them, the more I realized people today haven't heard these stories. Like military technologists and Air Force officers like myself hadn't heard these stories. So as a writer, to come across a set of largely untold and unheard stories, I mean, that's just gold. But what I really loved about them, aside from the fact that they're interesting and a fascinating phase of history, is that they're so relevant to my work today as an innovator and just the modern world we live in. So, they're more than 100 years old, 150 years in some cases. But the parallels we can draw between how they experimented, how they collaborated, how they tried to solve a problem that, frankly, a problem nobody had ever solved before.
Yeah, the subject matter and their personalities, I think, just emerge from this book. You center the book around a few innovators, 5 innovators. Can you briefly talk about each one
Sure.
and why you fit them into the book?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I did more research, I started with Octave Chanut's book. He's the main character in chapter 1. And I began sort of pulling the thread and seeing who else was doing work in this area and in this time. I was looking for 3 main attributes for why I would pick the main topics for the book. I was looking for people who were working before the Wrights, so before the problem of aviation had been solved. I was looking for people who actually built hardware, so not theoreticians, but no kidding, like field engineers who were building stuff and doing real life experiments. And then the third thing I was looking for is people who wrote about it. People who I wanted firsthand accounts of their stories, their experiments, why they were doing what they were doing, and what they actually attempted, what they actually accomplished. So that narrowed down the field pretty quickly. There are some people who were just doing, fascinating work that I would have loved to have included, but maybe they weren't building hardware, or they didn't write about it themselves, or their work began after the Wrights had their first success. So I came up with these 5 individuals that checked all 3 boxes.
And talk about them. Just give a sentence or two, because I don't want to spoil it, because I want folks to read the book, because it's such a great and easy read. Give us a sentence or two about each of the innovators and why you found them so captivating.
For sure. So Octave Chanut was a railway engineer at a time when the railroads were like the cutting edge of science and technology in the world. And at the age of 65, he began launching these gliders over the hills of Lake Michigan, I believe, or the sand dunes on Lake Michigan. So he's a great example of what it means to study failure. Why would we study failure, and why studying failure leads to breakthroughs eventually. He was a great collaborator as well. The second chapter is all about Otto Lilienthal. Otto Lilienthal was a German engineer. He was literally an engineer. He designed engines. And despite having a deep technical expertise in designing engines, when he shifted over to aviation, he built gliders that did not have engines in them, which was a remarkable decision for a man of his stature and his experience to make. He flew over 2,000 glider flights on a hill he built in his backyard. And was really quite a successful glider until he had his final fatal crash.
Until it wasn't.
Right. And that fatal crash is actually what inspired Orville and Wilbur. When they read about that, they had the remarkable reaction of like, oh, now we want to do that too. Like you hear the person died doing it, and that made them want to go try it as well. The third character in the third chapter is all about a Brazilian who spent most of his life in Paris, named Alberto Santos Dumont. He's my favorite. Of these five, he's just delightful, funny, quirky, weird. He was about 5 foot tall, 120 pounds. And he didn't build gliders. He built dirigibles and airships, so lighter than aircraft. And he's a terrific example of that iterative, experimental approach to build a prototype. It breaks, it fails, you learn, you improve it on the next one. By the time he got to his dirigible number 9, he was George Jetson before George Jetson was a thing. He would literally fly from his apartment down to the local cafe, have lunch, and fly home. I think he's the only human being who's ever had that ability to have that mode of transportation as just his daily transportation mode. He is just fascinating. Let's see. The fourth gentleman is a Bostonian, James Means. James Means was a shoe salesman who went into aviation, and he was just a brilliant sort of master of divergent thinking and putting things that seemingly contradicted each other together. So like he viewed gravity, for example, as the secret to flight, not a barrier to flight. And his approach to problem solving and collaboration and publication was just remarkable. The last guy that we sort of saved the best for last, I say Santos Dumont was my favorite, but Lawrence Hargrave was Octave Chanut's favorite. So the guy who wrote the first,
Right.
the original book, the guy in chapter 1, he said that if one man deserves to succeed in flying more than any others, more than all the rest of us, it's Lawrence Hargrave. He was an Australian, great simplifier, great experimenter. He started off with fairly complex designs of his models and his gliders and winged aircraft, and gradually got simpler and simpler. And eventually he was designing kites as a way to solve like the next piece of the problem in aviation, which was how do you generate lift? And he had kites that could lift a person off the ground. And one of the nice things about Hargrave, he was a great, he was like the early open source advocate. So he published everything, he patented nothing, and he just had a very generous posture with his work and shared it with the world because he just wanted to help advance the field.
It's so obvious to me in reading the book and how you describe the innovators that you really liked these folks and you cared about them. Flying didn't start with the Wright Brothers, which is one of the themes that I get from your book. They stood on the shoulders of a lot of people. Why, Dan, don't we hear about or think about the innovators that come before?
Yeah, well, I think this gets back to your very first question about why did I write a book about failure? We get squiggy about failure, don't we? You know, we like to follow the winners. I'm reminded of the scene in The Princess Bride where Prince Humperdinck shows up and he sees that there's been a great duel here, and they were master swordsmen. The winner went off this way and the loser went off that way. Should we follow them both, sir? Count Rugen asks, and he's like, the loser is nothing. We will only follow the winner. And
Right.
we have that same mentality in a lot of our other work. And yet studying failure is like the main theme throughout my whole book, because there's so much valuable learning we can get from studying failure, our own and others. And if we don't pay attention to our failures, we're likely to repeat them. So that's a big piece of all of this.
So some of the important tips that you provide, because you've been an innovator your entire career, relate to inclusiveness. And you specifically talk about James Means as being somebody who is pretty inclusive. Mm-hmm. How did that make his work different than perhaps some of the other innovators?
Yeah, I think it made it different in the sense that it made him more successful. He made more progress than those who were exclusive. In fact, my favorite line in the whole book is, I think, on page 105. If I could just read that line or part of that line to you, it says that, I wrote it down here. The people who made the most progress were the collaborators and the bridge builders, the includers and the inviters.
Right.
And the people who had the most time were the isolated, exclusionary purists, and the ones who wanted to kind of keep all their secrets. So the most obvious lesson in the book is study failure. I think the most important lesson in the book is about how diversity and inclusion helps us solve hard problems and solve them better, solve them faster. That's the kind of the heart of chapter 3, I think. So
Yeah. So let's talk a bit more about that, because you've got 5 innovators, 5 men, and yet you talk about women innovators in the field. Emma Lillian Todd, for example, is just a colorful person you write about.
Right.
Talk a bit more about her diversity and how they impacted innovation, and why they don't feature a bit more prominently in this history.
Yeah, so I mean, the history of aviation pioneers prior to the Wrights is it's hard to find. Like, there's just not as much out there as you kind of hinted before. And I do say the Wrights, not the Wright brothers, although I'm still sort of training myself not to refer to them as the Wright brothers, because Wilbur himself said, if the world ever thinks of us in connection with aviation, it must remember our sister. Catherine Wright was a huge contributor to the work they did, and had a big influence on their eventual success. And yet the world still calls them the Wright brothers and not the Wright siblings, or not the Wright family, right? Because we tend to sort of write them out of, no pun intended, we tend to write them out of the story. So similarly, Emma Lillian Todd in 1909 designed and built an airplane, and it flew. Not a lot of people have heard her name.
You got a great picture too in the book.
It's an amazing photo of her just sitting there. It's from a New York Times article from, I think, 1909. She began her work in 1906. So just 3 years after the Wrights had their first flight, she began building her own flying machine, which makes her one of the first human beings to design and build a plane, not just one of the first women. But yeah, they tend to not get as much of the attention and respect. And sometimes that's a deliberate choice on their part. In chapter 3, I talk about a woman, Ada da Costa, who was the only other person that Alberto Santos Dumont ever allowed to fly his dirigible number 9. Right. And when she landed, her parents were horrified and said, "No man would ever marry a woman who did such a thing. You can't tell anyone about this." So I think we're safely past the risk of any scandal. We can say her name out loud, and she did eventually later in her life begin telling this story. But even the men who did this work oftentimes did it secretly. Even the men who were involved in this area didn't do it very publicly, because they'd get mocked. They'd, oh, you're just a mad scientist. You're a loon. If God intended humans to fly, he would have given us wings. And so there's a lot of social pressure against these, innovators working in this space, especially in the late 1800s. But I think innovators today face much the same challenges: to not be too weird, not be too different. And innovators are often tempted to sort of innovate below the radar. And I think the women in this space had, 10 times as many reasons, or 10 times as much force put on them to kind of do it quietly and do it secretly.
Such great insights, and it's one of the reasons I picked Lyft and also wrote about it in my book column in the Boston Business Journal. But I liked Lyft because it's more than just stories about men and women who built flying machines, but it's really about your practical insights as an innovator, as an engineer over time. What do you hope business leaders and CEOs, entrepreneurs, students who might be listening to us and enjoying this event, what do you hope they take away from this book?
Yeah, I think there's two main takeaways, two main go do this type lessons. First is to study failure, and specifically to kind of help destigmatize failure. Let's fail out loud. Let's call it a failure. These planes that didn't fly, they were failures. We can use the F word there, but they were instructive failures. They were productive failures. They helped produce progress, but only if we study them. Only if we really sort of wrestle with the, dealing with reality as it is. We tried something and didn't work, but we learned something, and now that is going to inform our next experiment. So step 1 in studying failure is make a list of the things you've tried that failed, and then extrapolate from there and do the engineering analysis. All kind of goes into that. I often find, though, when we ask people to make a list of their failures, they can't. It turns out, we sometimes find out we haven't done anything that constitutes a success or a failure. We've had some meetings and we sent some emails, but we don't have anything that failed. So in that case, write down failed to fail. We have failed to do anything that could constitute a failure, and now go try something, do something concrete, something specific, build a prototype, build a model, put it out into the world, see if it flies. So that's kind of the first practical go-do.
So study failure and
Study failure.
cultivate, and you say this throughout the book, cultivate a specific perspective on failure.
Right.
You've got to do this, and you've got to be a supportive culture that does that. So for our CEOs who are listening, you should hear this.
Absolutely. Study failure. And as we study failure, we learn that failure is not the end of the story. Failure is not the whole story. And so the more we study it, the more we realize how important failure is to our learning, our growth, our development, and our ultimate success in our organizations. And then the second thing, I hope that my book shows the best thing any of us can do is to deliberately and consistently show up and commit ourselves to building teams that are diverse, that are welcoming, that are supportive, and that really celebrate all the dimensions of diversity. So, gender, ethnicity, physical ability, orientation, neurodiversity. When we do that, our ability to solve hard problems gets cranked up to 11. So it's the right thing to do. Yes, it's also the smart thing to do. So again, there's another go-do. Actively, proactively set out to say, I'm going to build the most diverse team I can, because that team is going to be better at solving hard problems than if I allow my team to be homogenous. So the worst thing we can do is let our teams become or stay homogenous. So if we're satisfied too easily or too superficially with kind of the minimum level of diversity on the team, that's not going to really have the impact that we're looking for.
Right. Can't be just virtue signaling. You have a quote in the book that I've actually written down and I have on a Post-it note because I liked it so much. You say, don't take risks. Do experiments. There's a difference. Talk about that.
So I kind of surprised myself as I went through the book. There's a piece of advice I don't give in the book, and the advice I don't give is go take risks. I fully expected when I started writing this book that one of the lessons would be take risks.
Right.
And it's not. The difference between instead of saying take risks, what I recommend is do experiments, and there is a difference. So in both cases, we're leaning into the unknown. We're going to try something where the outcome is maybe unpredictable or uncontrollable, or we're not quite sure what the outcome is going to be. If we frame that as taking a risk, then that's going to lead to one of two outcomes. Either we get lucky or we get hurt. Because a risk, a good thing turned out, we got the good result. We avoided the pain, we avoided the damage. It's so easy to dismiss that as, well, you just got lucky. And then it's harder to be repeatable. Or you get hurt, or you get killed, If you do an experiment, the only outcome is we get smarter. Now that smarter might smart a little bit, it might hurt. But the purpose of an experiment is to learn something. And if we try an experiment and it doesn't turn out the way we hoped it was going to turn out, we have now learned something that doesn't work. The other nice thing is that there is such thing as the experimental method. You can come up with a procedure for doing an experiment. There's no such thing as the risk-taking method. Like if I say, go take a risk. Well, how? Make sure it's a good risk. Take a smart risk.
Right.
That's just a much harder thing to do. Go do an experiment. Oh, I can do an experiment. But the really cool thing, and this gets back to the diversity and inclusion thing, we all have our general risk tolerance, our general appetite for risk. I'd like to think mine is fairly high, which isn't admirable necessarily. That's just how I'm baked in, right?
Right.
But the people who have a lower appetite for risk, they might find a safer way to do an experiment that will teach them something that I never would have learned if I had just gone off and done risky things. And so all the people in the book, they were doing risky things, but what they were really doing is doing experiments. So we can't avoid risks, but just pursuing risk isn't the point. Doing experiments and learning is the point here.
So thoughtful experiments, that comes loud and clear. And I think it's such a great theme for today, change makers, and creating the future. I just think the idea of thoughtful experiments instead of just taking blind risks makes great sense. Dan, are there industries or areas, market segments that you see doing this well, and are there others that are doing it not so well? Are there industries that are doing experimentation in a way that is thoughtful, appropriate in your view, and are there others that aren't so much?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, and I think from the little bit of research that I've done and looking at a variety of different industries and domains, everywhere I look, I find little pockets of creamy goodness where people are doing this. You could aviation, automobiles, energy sectors, public health is an area I'm starting to look into quite a lot lately. And everywhere I look, I find some places where you get small teams of dedicated, creative, diverse groups who are doing experiments and learning and sharing. And then you kind of find the other, oftentimes a larger segment of people who tend to be, more risk averse, more hypothetical, more quicker to embrace complexity and less fast to really pursue simplicity. And speed, thrift, and simplicity are kind of the three themes in all of my books, especially my first one, but a lot of that comes through in this third one as well. So I haven't yet found a place where that's not happening, where the speed, thrift, and simplicity, the experimentation, the diversity, again, everywhere I look, I find some places. The balance of the attention, kind of will vary from place to place. But the good news is you can do this kind of thing in any technical domain: software, hardware, medicine, law, I'm sure, anywhere. And the trick is to not just find, but then create the opportunities to apply this experimental study failure, work together with interesting people, this method of tackling hard problems.
And I think you've illustrated it too by telling stories, because in effect, that's what experiments end up being, telling a story, sometimes of failure. Dan, you've done so much. You're all constantly writing. What has surprised or intrigued you the most about this sort of innovation process? And what are you going to tackle next?
What am I tackling next? So I think I was initially surprised that why aren't these stories, these particular stories about these five individuals or aviation in the late 1800s in general, why aren't those stories told more widely? They're fascinating. And the book Lift is full of these brilliant line drawings and old photographs, which in large cases,
it's a very easy read.
It's a very easy read, and it is illustrated. And they're just, when you have these great pictures and these great stories, and they're interesting and they're readable. Even Chanute's book is more than 100 years old, but it's still so readable. He's funny even, and to find an engineer from the late 1800s who's funny, I mean, I did not expect that. So I'm often puzzled, why haven't we told these stories before? I think it's a bias against failure is a big piece of it. And then as far as what I'm doing next, I'm actually part of a team right now. We are collaboratively writing a new book. It's in the format of a choose your own adventure book. So it's written in the second person. The reader is the main character. You read a scene, and then, if you want to do, go through the door on the left, turn to page 25, go through the door on the right, turn to page 37. And the book, while the old choose your own adventure books were all fantasy adventure, this one's set in an office, and it's a team who has an idea about an innovation, and how do they go through making these different decisions about speed, thrift, and simplicity, mentoring, collaboration, prototyping. And it's just been a fascinating project to work on with, I think, 7 other co-authors. So looking forward to getting that out into the world soon too.
I can't wait to see it. Well, Dan Ward, thank you so much. The book is Lift. It's available at your favorite bookseller. And anyone who wants to get a hold of Dan, talk about blog or ways that people might send you questions or follow up on this great conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. You can visit my website. It's thedanward.com. So THE and then my name, danward.com. You can find me on Twitter. I'm also thedanward.com, because apparently Dan Ward was taken, so I get to be the Dan Ward.
That's terrific.
But would love to hear from folks if you have any questions or want to reach out. And on my website, you can get downloads and excerpts of the audiobook version, as well as, I think, a full excerpt of chapter 3, and some other free downloadable goodies on the website as well.
Terrific. Dan Ward, the book is Lift. Thank you very much.
Larry, thank you so much. This was a great chat. Thanks so much.